using shims to create a multi-piece rubber mold. In this tutorial, and this is part one of a two-part tutorial, I'll be showing how to create a rubber mold using keyed shims. And the keyed shims will be using wax paper cups, and more about that later on. But the whole idea behind this process is this allows you to make a multi-piece mold all at one time. So you're applying rubber to both the front and back half of the mold all at the same time while you're creating a keyed edge. And this process is ideal for fragile patterns, pieces that don't lend themselves to a traditional clay wall. And in this first part, I'll be showing how to create that keyed edge and the rubber mold portion. And then in part two, I'll be showing how to create the rigid support shell. Now, this is a very detailed and very involved process, so I definitely recommend stop the video now, grab a cold drink, get comfortable, get ready to learn. And of course, stay tuned for part two. In the second part of this tutorial, I'll be showing how to make the rigid mother mold that keys in to that rubber mold. Now again, this is a very involved process that I wouldn't recommend for beginners. Make sure you have a good understanding of this process and how and why it's applied before you start. This is incredibly helpful in the art bronze industry and other applications where the pattern doesn't lend itself to laying down or using a clay wall or a traditional splitter board kind of parting line. Now, before we get started, it's important to discuss material selection. That is uber important with this process. We want to make sure that we choose a silicone that will bond well to itself and a material that can be easily thickened to varying degrees. That is crucial to the success of this process. So for this process, we'll be using TC5130F platinum silicone, and then we'll be thickening that with SC5001 thixotropic additive, and also be using the FiberThick additive to make it even thicker in the last coats of the mold. Now, before we get started, it's important that our pattern is anchored to our baseboard. Here I have our little pizza wrap pattern anchored to our baseboard using hot glue. And I've got that anchored to a little 4-ounce container. And the reason for that is later on this mold will be used for rotational casting, and that will allow me to plug up that part of the mold. But more about that later on. But once we've got that anchored, then it's time to plan out where we're going to put our seam or our parting line. And for this, we're going to establish that across what is the natural horizon line of the piece, the high point of those little rat ears and head. And real important to have an idea of exactly where you're going to do this before you start applying rubber. Just like a cup block mold, you don't want to start putting material on until you know where your seams are going to be, because you don't want to have a seam in a place later on that could go through some critical detail. Now, once we've got that all figured out, how we're going to establish that parting line, we're ready to release our pattern, and for that we're using Zip 301 mold release. And Zip 301 is compatible with silicone. Real important detail. Make sure your mold release is compatible with your mold material. Now, in addition to the silicone that I recommended earlier, you'll need wax paper cups and quilting pins and some little blister key sheets. You want to cut those wax paper cups just like this. Cut the spine out of the cup and then straighten that out, and that will leave you with what is now a wax-coated shim material. And you're going to need a lot of these, so be ready to cut those little guys up into those shims, and you'll use some quilting pins that you'll insert into the cups just like this. And if you're careful, you can get it right between the layers of paper and get that pin to stand right up like that, and more about that later. And then, of course, in addition to that, you'll need copious amounts of clear tape and, of course, those little blister key sheets and some sharp scissors. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over all of the mixing and measuring steps, so if you're unfamiliar with that, be sure to check out my other tutorials here on YouTube. Now, first I'm mixing up, this is about a 300 gram batch, about 150 grams of A and 150 grams of B, and I'm going to pour that into the key sheet. Real important to do that before I get started with the rest of the mold, because the workflow that I'm using here, I'm going to need these keys later on, and these are going to take about an hour and a half to get to the point where they'll be ready to use. So I want to make sure they're poured and ready to use before I get to that step in the mold. And you don't want these poured too soon, otherwise they won't stick to the fresh silicone. So pour those before you get started, and now I'm thickening up the rest of the batch. So what's left is probably a little over 220 grams or so, and I'm adding some of the SC5001 to that. And what that's going to do is convert that more into a gel rather than a pourable liquid. And I need that to stay up on my piece. Now, this particular piece, our little pizza rat here, doesn't have much in the way of surface detail. He's fairly smooth, so I don't need this to be super runny. So I went ahead and added the thixotropic additive on the first coat. But if you're using this method over something like a really detailed piece, like an Indian with a feather headdress or something like that, and a lot of beadwork, something with a lot of really deep, intricate detail, then I would recommend doing a couple of layers with no thickener added, and just allow the silicone to flow into those details, and then allow it to gel and apply another layer just like that. And what that does is allows the silicone just to seep in and de-air itself and capture all of that surface detail. Now, since this is a very simple piece, I went ahead and added the Thixo on the first layer, and that allowed me to build that up a little bit faster. Now, that will gel in about 15 to 20 minutes. You can use your finger there to tap that flange at the base and test and see if it's ready to apply another layer. Typically, when you can tap that and none of the wet silicone comes off on your finger, that's a good indicator that you're ready to proceed with the next layer. Now, this next layer, this is TC5130F with pigment, and I've also added more of the Thixo to it. And the reason I'm adding the pigment to it is so I can see where this is going. Since I'm applying this to a slick surface that looks shiny and wet, this allows me to make sure that I'm applying this fresh batch of silicone everywhere it needs to go. Now, the working time with 5130F is fast, hence the F in the 5130. 5130F has a working time of about 7 to 8 minutes at room temperature, and the demold time of about an hour to an hour and a half. Now, in a brush-on mold like this, obviously we're not going to be demolding each layer after an hour and a half. But what we need to be aware of is the amount of time between layers. So typically, this will gel in about 15 to 20 minutes after you apply it to a point where you can apply the next layer. So this is ideal for small, medium-sized pieces to mold like this, because this allows you to work with minimal downtime, because right around the time you've applied one layer and you've got everything ready to apply the next layer, the first layer is gelled enough to allow you to apply that second layer. And if you're working in a warm environment, that will set up even faster. Now, if you are working with a larger pattern, a larger piece that you can't reasonably apply the silicone to it in that 7 to 8 minute working time, you can use just the regular TC5130. The regular 5130 has a working time of about 30 to 40 minutes at room temperature, so more than enough time for a larger piece. Okay, so the second coat has gelled enough that we're ready to go back and cut off our little drips, and now ready to build our shim wall. Now, this is the part that looks fairly tedious when you first see this, but once you get used to this, this actually goes fairly quick. Now, what we're doing is cutting out the rough profile out of that shim material, or that wax paper cup, and checking where it lines up against our piece, and then putting it back up there again. And a lot of this is just a good eye and practice and getting used to cutting this out. And once we get a good idea of that profile, then we're going to pin that in place using those quilting pins. And those pins will push right into our clay sculpture, or if we've applied a couple of layers already of silicone like we've done here, then we can press it right into that silicone surface. Now, what I'm showing here is one of the most critical and also one of the trickiest parts of the process to get used to. And what I'm doing is taking those quilting pins and pushing them in between the layers of that wax paper cup material. And the reason for that is that gives us a much more stable shim parting line once that's anchored to the side of our piece. And that allows those pins to be almost parallel with the shim material, and it just gives it a lot better stability. But again, this is one of those processes that works best over a clay positive. And I wanted to do this over a resin positive here just so you can see that it can be done over a rigid surface, but you can probably see right here that this is much easier to do when you can push those pins all the way into a clay positive, and then you just have a much more well-anchored and stable shim parting line. Now, you'll notice I'm leaving a gap of sometimes about 1/4 of an inch all the way up to about 3/4 of an inch, even an inch sometimes, between those shims. And that is by design. The reason for that is we're going to fill in those gaps once we've got all those shims in place with clear packing tape. And the reason I'm doing that, and I don't want those overlapping, is the whole point of this shim technique is we want as thin of a shim, as thin of a parting line as possible. So we want to keep that space minimal. We don't want this overlapping. That's one of the downsides between having overlapping playing cards or brass shims or anything like that, is that shim line and that seam starts to get fairly thick. Now, ultimately, in the finished mold, all of the shim material will be removed. So that will leave a very thin gap. And we want that gap to be as thin as possible for that mold to be as accurate as possible. So by using clear tape to fill in those gaps, that allows us to keep that shim as thin as possible. And you'll notice I'm applying 2 pieces of tape, one piece of tape to one side and one to the other, and then pinching that together and trimming off the excess. So a little tricky at first when you're looking at all this, but I promise in the end, this will all make sense. Now, the tricky thing also you want to be aware of is the wax paper cups don't really like tape sticking to them, and that's one of the reasons I'm using the tape on both sides and kind of pinching that together. So it's the tape holding the tape to itself more than sticking to the wax paper cups. Now, once we've got that shim line established, we're ready to tack that down to the rest of the piece with another coat of silicone. And this is what we typically refer to as shim tack, where we mix up a really thick batch of silicone and apply it to that edge. And that's why the edge doesn't have to be precise. We don't need that right up against the exact profile of the piece because we're going to fill that in with silicone. So here I'm mixing up more 5130F platinum silicone, and I'm thickening this batch with both the SC5001 chemical thickener as well as the FiberThick thickener, and that gets me a really nice frosting-like consistency. Now what I'm doing with this batch is tacking down the edge of that shim, and that will give it much more stability for the next part of the process. And once I go all around the horizon line anchoring that to our piece, then I can use the rest of the silicone to add more silicone to the actual part that I'm molding. So at this point, we have about 3 layers of silicone on our piece once I'm done applying this layer. So again, I'm going back in, filling in all those gaps, and then brushing the remainder of the silicone all over the rest of the piece. So this will just give us a lot more stability on that shim line and allow us to pull out those quilting pins later on. And that's an important step. You want that anchored well enough that you can go back and pull out all those pins, because the next step is we're going to add keys to that shim. So real important that it's stable enough that we can cut on that shim and add the keys to it without it falling over. So this is a very important step to make sure you take your time, build a solid shim wall there, and come back and then tack it down with that thickened silicone. And typically with this layer, I let this sit for at least an hour or so with the 5130F so it's nice and strong, so I can come back and cut on that shim wall without any worries of that tipping over or dislodging from that shim tack that I've applied to the base. Now, one of the things you can do at this stage as you're applying more silicone over the actual part is to start filling in undercut areas and building up the thickness of the mold. Now again, we have about a 7 to 8 minute working time, so you want to make sure you work efficiently and accurately and then move on to the next step. And also you'll notice how critical it is to have that really wide flange at the base, because that ultimately will key into our resin mother mold or support shell. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm taking an extra piece of that shim material, that wax paper cup material, and I'm cutting out a little pattern to use for making my keys. So I'm allowing myself a little over 1/8 of an inch surround on that pattern. So I cut out one of those little blister keys that I filled up with silicone earlier, and then I cut out this little pattern. And you'll notice that's a little bit bigger than the actual key. And now ready to start removing the quilting pins that hold up our shim wall. And if our shim tack silicone has been applied correctly, that should hold that shim wall in place, and it should be sturdy enough that we can easily go back and embed our keys into that wall. And the key step, again, this is one of those things that looks fairly tedious, but it really isn't that hard. Once you get used to it, all of this flows very nicely, and each step complements the following step. So real important to understand all of the steps in this process before you start this. Now what I'm doing here is I'm going to pick out a spot, a nice clean open spot to put my first key. And to do that, I'm using an X-Acto knife or a scalpel to use that little pattern to cut out that rectangle shape. And real important that that shape is bigger than the actual key that we're going to embed. And you'll see why here in just a minute. This is another one of those steps that, again, it looks tedious, but once you get used to it, all of this flows fairly fast. And for this piece, I'm putting in about 7 keys. So I'm just going to cut out those little rectangle shapes all over the piece. And then I'm going to go back and trim up any silicone that might get in the way of applying those keys. Now, real important, make sure that you don't touch those exposed keys, that you try to keep your fingertips away from those exposed keys, and try to minimize as much as possible touching the silicone anywhere you're going to be applying more silicone, because the oils from your hand can transfer over to that cured silicone and cause that silicone to not bond as well. So make sure anytime you're making a brush-on mold, you want to avoid touching the silicone between layers. Now, here what I'm doing is I'm cutting out these individual keys, and now I'm going to tape with Scotch tape. I'm going to put a little perimeter of tape around that key on the outside. You'll notice that's going outside that open area of the key. So that's the exposed silicone sticking right up there. And then I'm going to apply tape all around it. And this will all make sense here in just a minute. But I'm keeping that wide open. Real important not to have that tape touch that key surface, because later on, fresh silicone will need to bond to that exposed silicone. So we want to keep that wide open. Now, once we've got that tape all around, if we need to, we can take a scissors and trim that back a little bit. But what we're going to do is much like the tape that I used between those shims, we're going to put that into that shim. And see, I'm trimming away a little bit there right off screen, but we're going to put that in the middle of that open key shape, and that's why we made that a little bit bigger than the actual key. And that way the tape will stick to the tape on the other side. So now I've got the sticky side is facing the camera. And now I'm applying more tape to join those two together. So now I'm putting this side, sticky side down, and that pinches together, holding that key in place. And again, I know a lot of you are going to see this and think this looks incredibly tedious, but the more you do this, the more you get comfortable with this technique. And those of you in the art bronze world know what I'm talking about. This is something you get in your zone and you can just knock these little guys out. And I've keyed up some pretty large monument pieces even using this method in a relatively short amount of time. So here I'm just going back and trimming off that excess tape, and then applying more tape to the other side to kind of pinch it in place. And I know that's seems a little bit overly cautious about the thickness of the seam, but I promise that does make a big difference. If I have seen people just staple these keys in place, but it makes a big difference when you tape them like this and minimize the thickness of that shim, and then you just get a much cleaner, much better quality parting line when you open everything up later on. Now, all told, the time it took to put these keys in place was maybe about 10 minutes. And the time it took me to make the entire shim wall, pinning that in place, was maybe about 10 or 12 minutes or so. So overall, not a whole lot of time spent doing that, especially once you get used to it. I will say when I started doing this technique back in 1997, it did take me a while to get used to it, and I was fairly clumsy, and it took a while to get used to the process of putting these shim walls in place and learning that workflow. Back then, we didn't have super fast silicones to do this with, so a lot of this had to be done over the course of several days. So now, with the advent of some of these faster setting formulas, you can easily do a mold like this in an afternoon. So here I'm just taping again both sides of that so it kind of pinches that in place. But I cannot stress enough, do not touch the silicone, and especially don't touch those exposed keys, because you don't want oil transferring from your fingers to those exposed keys and causing those not to bond later on to the silicone. And this is one of those processes that I would watch this video a couple of times start to finish and even take notes on this, because there's a lot of parts of this process that don't make a lot of sense until you see the entire process done and see where this is all going. and now ready to mix up more silicone. Now this silicone I want to be just a little bit runny. I don't want it to be like frosting thick, but I do need it to be thickened somewhat. So I'm adding just a little bit of the SC5001, so it's kind of a gel consistency. And now I'm going to apply that to both sides of my piece. And once I've done this, now everything is much more stable and I'm ready to just finish up the mold by building up the rest of the thickness. So what I'm doing here is just brushing this all over the shim, the front and the back of the shim material. And again, just like with that shim tack, sticking down our shim to the piece. Once I apply that all over the shim, I'm using the leftover silicone to kind of fill in the blanks and apply it to the actual part. So our little pizza rat, he gets his silicone after the shim. So once everything's done, then we go back and fill in the middle. So this is both the front and now the back. And now you can see the advantage to that shim wall, because by applying that shim wall, now we're able to apply both halves of the mold at the same time. And that means we don't have to stop to make a different part of the mold. So we could have a multi-piece mold, 3, 4, 5, 6 parts, all made at the same time. So incredibly efficient mold process when used properly. Now remember your working time with this formula. This is a fairly fast setting formula, so we have that 7 to 8 minute working time and normally an hour and a half or so demold time. So you want to make sure you move efficiently and accurately. And from this point on, before each layer sets, what I'm doing is I'm going to take a palette knife, or you could also use a stir stick or a spatula, and we're going to run it along the edge of that shim. And the reason for that is that edge of the shim, we want to keep that exposed. Obviously, the rest of the shim is going to stay covered, but that leading edge of the shim, kind of that knife edge of the shim, we want to make sure that's exposed, and that will make that mold a lot easier to open and clean up later on. Now again, once I can tap that with my fingernail on a part of the flange there that's out of the way, and none of it comes off on my fingertip, I'm ready for another layer of silicone. Now you'll notice at this point, we've got a part that's becoming much more simplified. We're already filling in a lot of the undercuts. So now we can apply the silicone a lot thicker than we did on previous layers. So this is TC5130F, thickened with SC5001, and FiberThick. So it's a really thick frosting-like consistency, much like I did to stick those shims in place earlier. But now I can apply this much more liberally all over my part. And of course, I've also added some blue pigment just to make it more obvious where that's going. Totally optional to put pigment in there, but if you do, it definitely helps you track your progress a lot better. And here what I'm doing is just building up the thickness of the mold and making sure that that shim is really thick. And overall, our finished mold, what we're going for here is not so much the number of layers as much as the overall thickness. What we're shooting for here is a minimum of about 1/4 of an inch thick to about 3/8 inch on average. Now there are going to be places where the mold might be as much as 1/2 inch or more thick to fill in a deep undercut, and that's okay. But overall, we don't want this to be too thick, because especially if you're doing this for patterns in the art bronze world and you'll be casting wax patterns into the finished mold, you don't want this to be a really thick, clunky mold that will break your wax patterns when you try to demold it out of an overly thick mold. So you don't want the thickness of the silicone working against you later on. Now again, as I get that applied, once I've applied the silicone all over my mold, I'm ready to go back in with a palette knife and clean that up. So I'm scraping that, and you can see that shim exposed right there. See how that's exposed? We need that later on so that will easily open up and we don't have to fish for it with a sharp knife. So I'm just going back over that, exposing that seam, and then I'm going to use that palette knife to clean up the rest of the mold, because I want to fill in any deep undercuts with silicone and just smooth out that shape and streamline it as much as possible so we don't have any rough areas or undercut areas that will snag on our resin support shell. And this is where Palette knives are really handy for this. These steel palette knives you can pick up at most art supply stores. They're relatively inexpensive. You can reuse them. They're easy to clean up, and they work great for this kind of work where you're going in and smoothing this out. And if you ever strike out as a mold maker, you can always frost cakes for a living, because trust me, you will get really good at spreading frosting after spreading this much rubber all over monument pieces. Now again, once I get that smoothed out, one of the things you'll notice is I'm smoothing out that edge, that flange at the base, and the flange all around the outside so that I can apply keys to that later on, because real important, I want to make sure I'm able to embed keys on that flange later on. Now this is the final coat, and for the final coat on this, I'm mixing up more 5130F platinum silicone, blue pigment again. I added a little bit more blue pigment this time. And again, I'm thickening it with both the SC5001 and the FiberThick. And the reason for that again is I want this to be really thick, like frosting-like consistency. And this last layer, I'm going to smooth this out really nice, and then I'm going to embed keys. So this does take a little bit of timing here to make sure you have enough time to get everything applied and get your keys in place before the material starts to gel, because you want these keys to be bonded to your piece really well. Now what I'm doing here, this is a fairly medium to smaller size piece, so I had more than enough keys left over in that key sheet to embed on the outside of this piece. But if you're doing a really large piece, sometimes it helps to pour up several sheets of those little blister keys before you start, so you have plenty of those sitting around to embed later on. Because when you get to this step, the last thing you want to happen is to be short on those little keys. Now see there, again, I'm just exposing that edge and making sure that's all squared off. That gives me a nice squared edge, and that also helps me track the progress to see how thick my mold is. So again, I'm going for about 1/4 of an inch thick to 3/8 inch on average. So I'm going to trowel that back and then go in and smooth out all those areas so it doesn't have any rough areas that will snag on that mother mold. And now you'll notice I am touching these keys a little bit, but you just want to minimize that, do as little of that as possible. And there are going to be times when you're putting keys in weird areas where you might have to pin those in place so they don't sag or slump down the mold. Now I really didn't need to do it on this piece, but I wanted to at least show this so you can see how that works. You can use those same quilting pins again just to stabilize those keys while your silicone is setting. So you can just put those in place and pin those down with those quilting pins, and that just holds those in place while the silicone sets. But the rest of these keys did not require that. So you could just pop those out, put those in place, and you'll also notice that I'm just putting the keys on the flange and the base. And that is by design. I don't like putting keys on the actual surface of my pattern. And the reason for that is if those get out of alignment, you're going to have major distortions in your part. And it'll be really hard to tell if those are lined up or not until you get a bad part out of the mold. So by putting those just on that flange, we can make sure we know exactly where the keys are, and it'll be easy to see if they're out of alignment when we put everything together. So don't do what I call over keying, where you start sticking keys all over everything, because it gives it that much more opportunity for those keys to get pinched in the mother mold later on, or get out of alignment and wind up with these weird bulges on your part. And then sometimes you just have to cut those keys off because they start creating all kinds of problems for your mold aligning. So again, stick to the surrounding areas of just the base, the flange, and the outside of that shim wall, and that way you don't have to worry about those keys causing problems for you later on. Now use your time wisely, and at this point, once you've got all your keys in place, you can take your palette knife and do one more pass over your mold and make sure everything is smoothed out as much as possible. Remember, you don't want any of those little rough spots that could snag on your mother mold later on. So this is your last chance to do that. And if you want, you can always take some mold soap and some warm water and use that to smooth out that outside edge as well. And we've done that in previous tutorials, so check the end screen if you want some other further tips on brush-on molds with platinum silicone. Now, this is after everything has set up, and I'm using a scalpel here to remove the excess silicone around the base. Now, it's important to note that we don't want to remove the silicone from our pattern before we make our mother mold. So real important here, I'm just carefully removing just that silicone around the base or the flange. So that concludes part 1 of my shim tutorial. Be sure to stick around for part 2 where I'll make the rigid mother mold or support shell. And as always, all of the materials I use will be linked in the video description, so be sure to check those out. And those of you new to the channel or new to this process, be sure to check the end screen for links to other videos detailing the process of brush-on molds. Now, if you like this video, be sure to hit the like button and of course subscribe if you haven't already. And of course, thanks for watching and thanks for supporting the channel. And stay tuned for part 2 of the shim technique for multi-piece rubber molds.